You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 438 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about heroes, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, who are both fighting legal battles because they released information to the people. I got some updates on the Venezuelan regime change efforts as the U.S. government, along with regional actors and forces inside of Venezuela, look to dethrone Maduro, and important updates in Yemen that could be very positive and help bring food to the Yemeni people. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where you can find my show and daily news roundup on the homepage. If you're listening to the show and like it, make sure you subscribe to this show somewhere: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. It's on everywhere that podcasts are typically found. I update current events on the show, and the way you get the most out of it is by listening to every episode. And the way to make sure you do that is by that you're subscribing to the show. And then leave a rating or review if you're a big fan. And if you could think about donating to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Alright, Julian Assange first on today's show. The big updates in his case don't look good. The Swedish government is apparently reopening the rape allegations against Julian Assange. Now, from my understanding, they're not really bringing charges against him, but more or less just looking for him and questioning in that event, and I guess then they would seek to extradite Assange following his jail sentence at the UK. Now it'll be interesting to see if Assange ends up serving his full 50-week sentence for jumping bail in the UK, or if the UK government will cut this short and extradite him quicker. I'm guessing for the UK and Sweden, Assange is something like a hot potato. They don't necessarily want to be the country that's holding him, and would rather, ship him off, or in Sweden's case, keep him in the UK as long as possible. Because at the end of the day, and as Caitlin Johnstone points out, and I could link to one of her articles in the show notes page about this, the rape allegations against Assange are extremely flimsy. And to call them rape allegations is somewhat misleading. If it was in the US, I think they would look more towards something of sexual assault than actual rape. That's just the Swedish legal term for it. And of course, if, Assange did anything wrong or creepy to these women, I'm certainly not defending that. However, it seems that with the amount of evidence available, he certainly wouldn't be convicted of anything, and the available evidence suggests that he didn't, force a woman to do anything. Now, there's also the issue that in the many years that Assange spent in the Ecuadorian embassy, and there's been these allegations of rape against him, people have looked to get that evidence from the government and have been unable to do so, in part because the government started to claim that the evidence was deleted. So, if this evidence in now, 7-year-old rape case, doesn't even exist anymore, that seems to make a prosecution almost unlikely. Now, as I've talked about in the past on the show, I think one of the important things here is if he's in Sweden, he could be more easily extradited to the U.S. than in the UK. The extradition treaty between the U.S. and the UK has some protections for the kind of UK court system and says, hey, we're not just going to extradite anybody. It has to be a crime in the UK and the US. And so if you had some crazy situation, like in the worst kind of Trumpian nightmare, somebody violated a law in the US because they were Muslim, and then they fled to the UK. If the US then asked the UK to extradite them, the UK would say, no, this clearly isn't a crime in the UK, and therefore, that person could live here free. Same thing here with, there being a real problem with what Julian Assange is doing is journalism, and the UK might not want to set that precedent in their courts by saying that, no, that's a crime and we're going to ship him to the US. And I guess in Sweden, that's not the case. If the U.S. just says we want them, they can end up handing him over. I think they also point to a couple examples now. This is Assange's advocates of cases where Sweden actually turned over Muslims, I think some of whom were certainly not guilty of what they were being accused of, sent to Egypt and were tortured there on, kind of behest of the U.S. rendition program, War on Terror time here. Obviously, there's still a lot left to play out here in the Assange case, and I'm not saying that, now that this rape investigation has been reopened, he's going to be sent to Sweden and then pretty quickly back to the U.S. He may still have some legal cases he could use to help him fight here, possibly popular opinion in Sweden, the UK. I know it's probably not going to happen in the U.S., but I could still hope, would change some government's mind and equation here and, say that, no, this, guy clearly is just being persecuted for releasing information to the rest of us, doing just acts of journalism. I feel like I've covered the kind of topic on why I don't think Julian Assange is a criminal on the show a lot recently, and the importance of WikiLeaks and, kind of how what they're trying to target him for is the leaks related to Chelsea Manning, which are really important, the Afghan, Iraq war laws, Guantanamo files, and State Department cables. All right, last thing I'll mention, more on the Assange case is just that Elizabeth Voss is doing this nice series over at Consortium News where she's looking at all the things that WikiLeaks has put out and going through and breaking down why they're important and the important leaks that came out of them and what they showed the people about their government that they wouldn't have otherwise know that was being covered up. And so this is, I think, a really important series, especially, for people like me who are on the younger side and don't really remember or have a good recollection of, especially the, Iraq war laws and stuff like that coming out. All right, so Chelsea Manning is out of jail as of the recording of this podcast, but that may not last long. So first of all, I think this is a good thing. Even if, Chelsea ends up back in jail, unfortunately, in a couple of days, and this is just a very temporary reprieve from her terrible conditions there, hopefully, this is somewhat lifting her spirits, maybe gives her some new flexibility or options going forward, a little bit more power in the legal battle. I think you're probably pretty limited in what you're able to fight to try to get out of jail, but to stay out of jail, I think, is probably a little bit easier. So what seems to happen is the grand jury term that she was supposed to, was subpoenaed for and was being forced to testify without any legal counsel, without being able to see the questions ahead of time, without being able to talk about them after. And so kind of really stuck in going into this court and giving a sworn statement. I mean, a very dangerous thing to do here. On really, I think, moral grounds and principle grounds, Chelsea Manning maybe had some legal options that could have kept her out of jail, but she went and invoked her First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights at these hearings to basically say that what you're doing here, the whole court you're running, is extremely unfair. And because she failed, to testify in front of that grand jury, she was held in contempt of court and thrown in jail. For the first few weeks, if not up to close to a month, she was held in solitary confinement, only allowed out of her cell in the middle of the night for about 2 hours, not allowed reading material or pretty much anything to do in her cell for the other 22 hours of the day. Anyways, that grand jury expires. A new one's impaneled, and then so she's subpoenaed, but in the meantime, she's not in contempt of any court. And so I believe until at least the 16th, she'll be freed. I haven't heard an official statement if she's going to take the same tactics and maneuvers she did the first time, which would seemingly lead her down the same road and back to a jail cell, or if maybe her defense team has a new strategy or plan that will hopefully keep her out of jail. Something that Peter Van Buren points out, and this isn't really to say that I think Chelsea is doing the wrong thing by taking the stand that she's taking, but that Chelsea Manning is a much more powerful figure, especially with all the stuff going on with Julian Assange right now. If she's out of jail, if she's in jail, she's very limited on the statements she could put out, and all of her attention is probably put on getting her own self out of jail, where if she's kind of free and able to do what she pleases, then she could go and advocate for Assange and hold rallies and, kind of even go on different news programs or something and say, hey, I gave this information to Julian. What the government is doing here is wrong, and here's why. So I think that's an interesting take, and I guess what I'm saying is I'm hopeful that something here will happen that will allow her to stay out of jail. All right, on to some other news in the U.S. Patrick Shanahan, who's been the acting Secretary of Defense since James Mattis stepped down at the beginning of the year, has been nominated by Donald Trump to become the Secretary of Defense. I'm going to link to an episode of the show in the past where I've talked about what I felt like was the potential corruption of Patrick Shanahan and why I don't think he's a great choice to be Secretary of Defense, rather than going over that all again on today's episode. But I'm not very optimistic that he's going to be any kind of great voice of reason here in this administration. He seems to have been pulled along with a couple of the more hawkish, movers and statements by Bolton and Pompeo, including some of the things that have come out in relation to what's going on in Iran. Although he has kind of come out and said that the Pentagon isn't making plans to invade Venezuela or anything like that, which I think were positive statements at the time when you had Pompeo and Bolton certainly suggesting that was something that could possibly happen. From what I've read so far, I don't see anybody really mounting an opposition to him. This is a weapons maker guy, and so I'm guessing he's probably pretty acceptable to everyone. There's of course some issues ongoing right now with the Pentagon looking to buy Boeing F-15 and then the S variant, which is in place of buying Lockheed Martin made F-35s. And I don't know if that means that some senator that's really backed by Lockheed is going to try and make a stink about this and oppose the guy, or if all the weapons makers kind of agree that as long as their guy's in charge, they're all going to get paid pretty well. Boeing just might get a little bit of an edge on this one, and, that's just the game. Of course, there's going to be a lot of money to go around with this new Space Force thing taking off. We have the CBO scoring that says the Space Force is going to cost $3 billion up front and then $1.3 billion to operate annually. It's quite a steep increase over the Pentagon estimates that I think was less than $2 billion up front and $500,000 annually. Was this money going to be done? I'm sure a lot of it's going to get funneled to the weapons makers for different research on space-based weapons programs, satellites, all kinds of stuff that's going to enrich them and make us poor, and also, make the world a more dangerous place by weaponizing space. The FBI said they have 850 ongoing investigations of domestic terrorism. There wasn't a breakdown on whether this is more white separatist groups versus domestic terror coming from lone wolf terror attacks. My guess is, as I've covered on the show in the past, a lot of these are kind of entrapment things where they just look for people who are susceptible to radical ideas. Maybe people with mental illness are lower on the IQ side, don't really have direction in life, maybe outcasts from their own communities, and gets them to develop a plan along with the FBI, not really on their own. Like, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to shoot up this place or that place? Then the FBI gets them to buy something at the hardware store and arrest them as being a terrorist. I always like to break this down because it's something that I think invokes a lot of fear. Oh my God, if there's all these ongoing cases of domestic terrorism, then, who's going to shoot up a school tomorrow and all these other crazy things? When in reality, a lot of those are law enforcement baiting people into coming up with plots that they never would have in the first place. All right, Venezuela stuff. Sanctions, I'll go over that first. The U.S. is really looking at sanctions, I guess, as bribes now. It seems like the plan is to sanction just about everybody around Maduro and offer them potentially money on the back end, but definitely sanctions relief if they defect to the other side. I think it's almost telling the number of people who haven't succumbed to this plan and continue to be allied with Maduro. Kind of shows that it's not going to work in the long run. There's, I guess, one general now who had sanctions relieved on him because he followed this plan. There have been statements saying that they're really pushing sanctions against people within the security and defense of Venezuela. So I guess this would mean maybe a little bit lower ranking military officers or something like that, as well as sanctioning any other companies or countries that are doing business with this portion of Venezuela's economy, along with much of the rest of it, with the oil sanctions we put in place and sanctions on other types of equipment and stuff like that. I heard some really interesting analysis on the Scott Horton show recently, saying that one of the reasons that Venezuela right now is having a lot of blackouts and stuff like that is because of the sanctions, being unable to import German parts for their power plants. I guess it's Siemens is the company that makes the power plants. And so then when things break, they can't repair them because they can't get the parts in. And this is a concept that I've talked about on other shows as well, related to Iranian planes, where they're falling out of the sky at a much higher rate because they can't import parts for their planes that are either European or US made. As always, sanctions hurt the people. and this seems to be what's happening in Venezuela. I've talked about the 40,000 number that's been now floated, the increase in the general mortality of the Venezuelan people because of U.S. sanctions. Maduro isn't starving. His family's not starving. He's corrupt. He's probably continuing to get rich. And as I explained in the past on the show, it actually ends up a lot of times being these high-ranking government officials that are best in place to kind of do some smuggling and back-end deals to get around U.S. sanctions. And, if you're looking to sell oil or something like that, if you could smuggle it, then you're going to take kind of a higher cut of the whole thing. And the people best in the position to do that are, people involved with the state oil company or the military or the state shipping company, whoever is doing all those transactions. And so rather than, groups like the IRGC in Iran or whatever kind of high-ranking officials surround Maduro, they're going to end up getting individually richer. I think the most concerning news I have on Venezuela is Guaido ordering his envoy to the U.S. to meet with Pentagon officials. Now, I don't know what they're saying, and maybe Patrick Shanahan will say your cause is absolutely crazy, and the Pentagon is never going to be involved with troops in Venezuela, but that's some pretty optimistic thinking on my part. And if he's going and trying to meet with the Pentagon, maybe he's really trying to convince the U.S. to do a military intervention here, at least on a small scale, to try to kickstart a revolution in Venezuela. And even if things start small, which is, I think, probably the level they would try to convince Donald Trump at, it's only a few hundred troops. We're going to put them in. We're just going to train up a couple guys, isolate off a little chunk of the country so they could live safely. We'll quickly expand and turn to a whole lot more. The last thing I want to mention on Venezuela is actually the fight going on in the U.S. for the Venezuelan embassy. I think it's somewhere around D.C., where right now there's advocates kind of for the Venezuelan government and are there by permission of the Maduro government in Venezuela within that embassy after the Venezuelan envoy was told they had to pat their beds and go by the U.S. government. So now they have U.S. citizens in that embassy trying to hold it from protesters who are trying to kick them out of that embassy and give it over to the Guaido people. It seems like the people inside have a pretty good hold for now, and unless the U.S. decides to make some kind of intervention, I guess it would be with the Secret Service, is the armed force that kind of controls that, and they go in there with their guns and start arresting people and telling them to leave. Maybe they'll be able to hold on to this embassy long enough to kind of stave off this political crisis. And, the year that Juan Guaido declared himself to be president of Venezuela, and then, Maduro will be able to send ambassadors back to the U.S., and that way the U.S. and Venezuela can engage in talks and better diplomatic relations, which is what, the people inside the embassy say is their point. Not necessarily to provoke a fight, although, they're certainly hanging a lot of banners out there and getting news attention and doing, I think, some good activism on trying to spread the word of, why the war in Venezuela would be bad and telling the American people, hey, y'all should pay attention to this for a couple minutes. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and some others in the Trump administration are really pushing for war here in Venezuela, but they're also saying that they're holding the embassy. That way Maduro's people could come back in and reestablish a good relationship with the U.S. Whereas if you get the Guaido people in, who knows if you'll ever be able to get them out. I wish I would have gone over this first now that I'm thinking about, but this is where it's just going to be in the show. CNN did a story last week where they said that Guaido was elected in the beginning of the year, which is, of course, just a lie, and it apparently took them hours to fix this story because he just declared himself to be president. Now, he claims that there's a constitutional thing in the Venezuelan constitution that says anybody could declare themselves president for 30 days if the president is incompetent or unduly elected or not representative of the people or whatever. I think everybody who's kind of understands the Venezuelan constitution says this isn't really what that portion is for, and Guaido's interpretation is pretty generous towards himself. But even then, that title is only supposed to last for 30 days, and it seems quite clear at this point that he doesn't have enough support for the Venezuelan people to overthrow that government. So CNN really earning that fake news badge by posting something that isn't even kind of true at all. And it's quite amazing that they could make that mistake and it could get through different copy editors and stuff like that. And then not for them not to change it right away when they're being relentlessly mocked for their terrible, terrible reporting. On North Korea, Donald Trump said that he didn't see it as a breach of trust, the recent North Korean missile test. And so that's good. I think that Trump seems to be saying that, hey, we're still kind of in this talks process and within this freeze for freeze agreement, not saying that we're going to restart some war games or anything like that to provoke the North Koreans. At the same time, I really think that if Donald Trump is serious about trying to achieve some kind of peace in North Korea and really ramp down tensions there and possibly get a denuclearization deal done, he really has to start looking at reducing sanctions on North Korea. The U.S. has seized a few cargo ships now headed to North Korea. I think one was Indonesian flagged. I'm not quite sure what flag this most recent ship being intercepted was, but it does seem like they're really trying to enforce these sanctions against this country of people that are starving to death. It is the really sad part about it. ISIS has declared it has an affiliate now in Indian-controlled Kashmir. How closely tied this Islamic State affiliate is to the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, not any official affiliation with the ISIS, although there's, been a lot of accusations of the ISI that they supported terrorist groups and maybe to a far greater and more overt extent than even the U.S. government has with our interventions in Afghanistan going back to the Soviet era. A lot of times India holds Pakistan responsible for any kind of Muslim insurgency being fought in Kashmir, although, all of us who understand blowback and everything get that, a Hindu government in India cannot go in and just oppress the Muslim people of Kashmir into submission without expecting that quite a few of them are going to want to fight back and, possibly attack Indian soldiers and stuff like that. But with ISIS acting in the area, a group that, as I've explained in the past on the show, their goal is to destroy the gray zone, to convince the Muslim people and the people of the rest of the world that they can't live together. That way they could have their Muslim, Islamic, extremist caliphate state where, people aren't allowed to smoke or make jokes or be happy, and they just enforce their strict Islamic law and have sex slaves and all that other crazy stuff. And, this is a really hot, intense area. And so maybe this is something that ISIS sees as ripe for exploitation. So I just want to cover that story for that reason. All right, in Israel last Friday, we had one Palestinian killed and at least 30 others injured by live fire from Israeli snipers. This continues to go on at the protest every week, right there on the Gaza border. All right, last up here, I want to talk about Yemen and the Port of Hodeidah, where back in, I think, November and December, an agreement was negotiated in Stockholm. I believe it's just been called the Stockholm Accords internationally, that was supposed to bring a ceasefire to the city of Hodeidah and a transfer of the control of the ports in Hodeidah. There's 3 ports in total over to UN control. Now, this agreement was really never started other than the ceasefire, which has more or less held over the past few months. There's been intense rounds of fighting. There's been rounds of bombing, but generally in the Hodeidah area, I think the fighting has been a minimum. Certainly not what was expected if the Saudi-backed forces are, especially backed with an air campaign trying to take the city of Hodeidah and the ports from the Houthis. The Houthis on their end have control of the ports there and have not handed them over to the UN government side. I see a lot of reasons for the Houthis to be skeptical of this whole thing. There was also the issue with the grain silos, which was resolved in the past couple of weeks, where there was food, 51,000, I believe, tons of food rotting in some grain silos as the rest of the country starved because the UN wasn't able to access them crossing competing lines around Hodeidah. And so I don't know what kind of deals got struck in the back room here, but it does seem that progress is being made. I guess we'll know officially on Tuesday. A UN inspector is set to arrive in Hodeidah and actually visit the ports and see that the Houthis have turned over control of those ports to what they're calling the Yemeni Coast Guard. And I don't know who that is. In the past, the Houthis claimed they turned control of the ports over to the Yemeni Coast Guard, but that turned out just to be a bunch of Houthis in Yemeni Coast Guard uniforms, and so the deal was never implemented. There's several other parts of the Stockholm Accords, including a big prisoner swap that, to my knowledge, hasn't happened yet. And there's also been a lot of fighting in other areas of Yemen. And so even if, things are kind of cooling off and look good here in Hodeidah, it doesn't mean that, the air war and the other fighting around the country has ramped down really. Now, the reason this is so important is because of the food. The Yemeni people are starving to death. Yemen doesn't produce a lot of its own food. It certainly didn't before the war, and we know from reporting that Saudi Arabia has essentially waged a food war against Yemen, bombing flocks of sheep, farm equipment, factories, cereal plants intentionally in order to make sure that Yemen couldn't produce their own food and would be completely reliant on outside food that Saudi Arabia was controlling coming in and out of that country. And so it was really like a medieval siege starvation tactic that seemed to be really starting to bite, as the UN was saying that, hey, this famine is going to kill an awful lot of people this year if something isn't done really fast. And so if the control of these ports are turned over, then hopefully there's like some reciprocating action from the Saudi side and they start to lift the blockade of Hodeidah, which is a little bit different kind of blockade because they do allow some ships, and there's just an extremely rigorous inspections regime that essentially prevents any ships from making it to port before the food on board rots. So yeah, that's the news on Yemen. Hopefully more food getting to the people. Not sure what consequences this will have for the larger war. In the past, I read on the Moon of Alabama blog that he felt like the Houthis would be unlikely to give up the ports because it was something of a concession of defeat. Now that was many months ago. And so maybe strategically things have changed either on the ground in Yemen or with Houthi weapon capabilities that allow them to feel comfortable giving control of the ports over to a third party, and that food will then be allowed to come into their country. All right, guys, I'll be back at it again on Wednesday. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you are, maybe this is a good time to remind people, share it. libertarianinstitute.org online. Subscribe to the show to somewhere, give it a rating and review, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, and follow the Twitter feed. I'm doing a little bit more with it right now at KYAAALE.